3 horses. A debt of 3 horses brought a knight named Tnugdalus to a friend's dinner table in Cork in 1148, and he stayed to eat, and somewhere between the plate and his mouth, his whole body simply quit. He went down at the table, no pulse anyone could find. His skin went cold everywhere except one faint patch of warmth on his left side, and that little patch of warmth is the only reason the people in that house didn't put him in the ground. They laid him out from Wednesday to Saturday, 3 days. And on the Saturday, at what one account calls the 10th hour, the corpse sat up screaming. Most people now call him Tundale, kinder on the tongue for everybody. And what he said, once he stopped screaming and took communion and drank a little water, changed the way half of Europe thought about dying. He said he had been to hell. He described it room by room. And then he gave away everything he owned to the poor, had the sign of the cross sewn onto his clothes, and spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen exactly what waits underneath the floor of the world. Now, whether Tundale actually saw anything, or dreamed it, or whether a monk built the whole thing out of older stories I'll get to. What matters for tonight is what the church did with it. Because a monk did write it down, an Irish Benedictine named Marcus, working at a monastery in Regensburg in 1149, 1 year after the knight supposedly hit the table. And that text got translated 43 times into 15 different languages. 172 Latin manuscripts of it have survived into our time, and manuscripts don't survive in those numbers unless people are copying them constantly, on purpose, for use. Priests preached from it, and parents told it to children. It was a tool. And this whole video is about that toolbox, the full set of instruments the medieval church used to keep an entire continent obedient and afraid. Some of those instruments were stories. Others were fires with human beings inside them, and we are going to get to those too, in more detail than you may want. Before the night wakes up properly, a quick hello, welcome in, and if you're new here, you've picked a grim one to start with, so settle in. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I do go through them, and the spread of countries on these long videos surprises me every time. A huge thank you, as always, to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members. You are the reason a video like this gets researched properly instead of thrown together. And if you'd like to join them, the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. All right. Back to the dead man in Cork. The vision Marcus recorded goes like this. The moment Tundale's soul left his body, it found itself alone in darkness, and the demons arrived almost instantly, a crowd of them pressing in close, screaming into his face that he belonged to them now, listing his sins back to him with what the text describes as real delight. He had been, by his own admission afterwards, a violent man, proud, generous only to entertainers, indifferent to the church. The demons knew all of it. They started dragging him down. An angel stopped them, a thin mercy. The angel escorts Tundale down through the torments rather than away from them, and in some of them, the soul is made to participate. The tour goes down through punishments matched to sins, each one engineered with a craftsman's attention to detail. Murderers are cooked on an enormous iron lid laid over fire, and they melt on it the way fat melts in a pan, running liquid through the metal, and then they reform on the other side so it can happen to them from the start. Thieves and cheats have to cross a bridge over a valley of fire, and the bridge is a plank studded with iron nails, and Tundale himself is made to walk it. He isn't allowed to cross empty-handed either. He once stole a cow, so he has to drive a cow across those nails with him, the animal panicking and slipping, his own feet opening up on the spikes with every step, blood running off the plank into the dark. When he reaches the far side, the angel heals him, and the tour continues, and you get the sense the healing exists mainly so the next thing can hurt properly. The one people remembered most, the one that shows up in sermons and later in paintings, involves a beast sitting on a frozen lake. It swallows the souls of the lustful, and specifically of clergy who broke their vows, and inside its gut the souls are somehow made pregnant, all of them, men as well as women, and what grows inside them are serpents. The birth is the punishment. The creatures tear their way out through the flesh itself, through arms and chests, and the heads of the serpents have iron beaks, and they turn back on the soul that bore them and start eating. On the ice. Forever. A monk wrote that. A monk sat in a scriptorium in Regensburg with good ink, and wrote that scene specifically so that other monks could recite it to farmers and fishermen and their wives, and it worked. It travelled from Ireland to Iceland to Belarus, because nothing spreads like fear with a plot attached. At the bottom of everything sits Lucifer himself, and Marcus describes him bound, which surprised me the first time I encountered it. The devil is a prisoner too, black as a raven, the size of a mountain, chained to a burning gridiron with iron and bronze, and he has hundreds of hands, each hand with claws longer than lances, and he grabs souls the way a thirsty man grabs grapes, crushing them in his fists, and when he exhales he scatters them across hell, and when he inhales they come back to him. He is in agony the entire time, and his agony makes him crueler. The souls down there with him are the worst of the worst, and the angel makes a point of telling Tundale that some of the people he is watching had been princes and prelates. Powerful men, churchmen. That detail did a lot of quiet work, and I'd argue it was aimed as much at bishops as at peasants. Tundale also gets shown the other direction, the fields of the saved, walls of silver and gold and precious stone, and King Cormac of Munster is up there in a beautiful house, though even Cormac has to suffer 3 hours a day for an old broken oath and an old adultery. Nobody gets out clean in this vision, not even kings, not even the saved. 3 days after the collapse, the soul is stuffed back into the body, and the knight wakes up screaming among the mourners, and from then on, he is the church's most persuasive living exhibit in Ireland. And the story of his trip is copied and copied until the printing press picks it up centuries later and copies it some more. Now, I said I'd come back to the question of whether any of it happened, and here is all we have. The text says Tundale was a real Knight of Cork and dates the vision to 1148 precisely, and Marcus claims he heard the account and translated it from Irish. No independent record of the man exists outside the vision text. What we can say for certain is that the document was produced within a monastery, by a monk, in a genre that monks had been producing for 500 years, and that the Church distributed it with enthusiasm across the whole of Christendom. You can weigh that however you like. The people hearing it in 1180 had no way to weigh it at all, and that was rather the point, because Tundale was not the first dead man to come back with a report. The genre goes back centuries before him, and one of the earliest English examples comes from Bede, writing his history of the English Church around 731. Bede tells the story of a Northumbrian householder named Drythelm, a decent family man by all accounts, who sickened and died one evening around the year 696. He lay dead through the night. At dawn he sat up, and everybody gathered around the body to mourn him ran for their lives, everyone except his wife, who stayed, trembling, and I think about her a lot, standing alone in a room with her husband's corpse while it looks at her and starts talking. What Drythelm did next left no doubt about how seriously he took what he'd seen. He walked to the village church and prayed until daylight. Then he divided everything he owned into 3 parts, one for his wife, one for his sons, one for the poor, and he walked away from all of it into the monastery at Melrose, where he took a hidden retreat by the river and spent the rest of his life doing penance for sins nobody had known he was worried about. He had been shown a valley, one side blasted with flame, the other side buried in hail and snow, and souls thrown endlessly from the fire into the ice and back, never allowed to settle into either torment long enough to get used to it. And beyond that valley, a pit, with globes of fire rising and falling, human souls carried up inside the flames and sucked back down, and a stench and laughter. The demons in Drythelm's account laugh. They came for him too, before his guide returned, and the memory of that stayed in him for the rest of a long life. The monks at Melrose used to watch the old man stand in the River Tweed in winter, with ice drifting past his body, chest deep, reciting psalms through blue lips, and when they asked him, "Brother, how can you bear that cold?" he answered, "I have seen greater cold." He would climb out and let the wet clothes freeze and dry on his own body, and when they asked how he could stand it, he said, "I have seen greater austerity." Bede notes, almost in passing, that his story converted many. No surprise. A man who voluntarily stands in a frozen river until his skin turns grey has seen something, or believes he has with a conviction indistinguishable from having seen it, and every person watching from the bank absorbed the lesson without a single word of doctrine. The visions kept coming, and they kept getting more specific. In 1196, a monk of Aynsham Abbey near Oxford fell into a trance over Easter and returned with an account naming punishments for particular sorts of people. including recently dead clergy that his hearers could actually identify, a bishop suffering for the way he'd lived, lawyers, the whole professional class of England getting sorted into their torments. In 1206, an Essex peasant named Thurkill, a simple ploughman, was taken on his own tour, and his hell included something new and honestly ingenious: a theatre. An arena where demons sit in iron seats as an audience, and the damned are dragged into the middle and made to perform their own sins in front of the crowd. The adulterers made to repeat the act while being torn, the proud man strutting while his fine clothes burn into him. The whole of somebody's shame turned into an evening's entertainment for hell. Whatever else you want to say about the 12th century, it understood humiliation. Even emperors starred in these tours. A vision attributed to Charles the Fat, circulating in the late 800s, walks the Carolingian ruler through valleys of the dead, where he finds his father's bishops and councillors boiling in pitch, and then his own father, Louis the German, standing to his thighs in a vat of scalding water, who tells his son that prayers and masses can lift him out of it, and who points to a second vat boiling empty beside his own, prepared, he says, for Charles. Politics ran straight through the afterlife, a dead emperor deployed to frighten a living one into better behavior toward the church. Notice who is writing all of this down: monks, every single time. Either the visionary becomes a monk like Drythelm, or the scribe is a monk like Marcus, or the visionary already is one, like the man at Aynsham. The genre lived inside monasteries the way law lives inside courts, and it flowed outward through one channel above all, the sermon. A parish priest in a village of 80 people could not explain the Trinity to save his life, and plenty of them could barely manage the Latin of the Mass. But he could tell the one about the beast on the frozen lake. Hell came to ordinary people as stories, told from the pulpit in their own language by the one literate man they knew. And the preaching was relentless about the physical mechanics. This fire burns and never consumes, so the burning never ends. The worm gnawing the damned never dies. Preachers dwelt on the senses one at a time, what the damned see, what they smell, what they hear, the screaming that never has to pause for breath because the dead don't breathe. One popular line of pulpit reasoning asked listeners to hold a finger in a candle flame for as long as they could stand it. Then consider that the pain of that moment over the whole body, without end, without hope of end, is the standard sentence for dying with a single mortal sin unconfessed. 1. You could live 60 years of charity and drop dead an hour after your one bad Thursday, and the sentence was the same as a murderer's, eternal, no appeal, no parole, because eternity has no parole board. Children got this from the beginning. The catechism of fear started as soon as a child could understand language, and deathbeds got it hardest of all, and the deathbed itself will close this video. In the meantime, the shape of the thing was simple. The church had built a picture of the afterlife so detailed and so terrifying that no ordinary person could contemplate it calmly, and the same church held the only exit: confession, absolution, the sacraments, burial in holy ground. Every single one of those passed through the hands of a priest. Fear was the product, and relief was the product, and the same shop sold both, which made the 12th century's next doctrinal development one of the most consequential ideas in European history, because right around the time Marcus was writing up Tyndale, theologians were finishing work on a third destination, somewhere between heaven and hell, a place of temporary fire, purgatory. The historian Jacques Le Goff spent a career on this and argued that purgatory as a fully worked out place, a named location with its own geography, snapped into focus in the late 1100s. The raw idea was older. Prayers for the dead go back to the early church. But the doctrine hardened right then, and once it hardened, everything about the emotional life of Europe changed. Hell is a door that closes forever. You can grieve someone in hell, but you cannot help them. And honestly, most people refuse to believe their own mother was there anyway. Purgatory was different. Purgatory said, "Your mother is probably not damned. She was a decent woman, but she is not in heaven yet either. She is in fire right now. Real fire," the theologians insisted. Fire that differs from hell's fire in duration and nothing else. She is burning as you sit here, and she is burning off the residue of every small sin she never fully paid for in life. Every sharp word and every skipped fast, and this could take decades, centuries for some. And you, the living, could shorten it. Prayer shortens it. So do masses said for her soul, and alms given in her name, and every one of those channels ran through the church, and every one of them could be measured in money. Rich families endowed chantries, whole chapels with a salaried priest whose entire job was to sing mass for the souls of the founders, daily, in perpetuity, meaning a man in a cold side chapel repeating your name at an altar 50 years after everyone who loved you had died. English wills from the period are full of it. Income assigned forever so the burning could be eased. The poor could not buy perpetuity, so they bought what they could, a single mass, a candle, a fraternity membership that promised the prayers of the group when you died, membership dues for the afterlife. People at the bottom of society went without to purchase relief for their dead. And given what they believed was at stake, of course they did. What would you not pay to take your mother out of a fire? Indulgences slotted into this machinery and eventually became the most notorious gear in it. The theory ran that Christ and the saints had built up an infinite treasury of merit, and the Pope held the keys to it, and he could apply that merit to reduce time in purgatory, yours or a dead relative's, in exchange for pious acts. Pious acts drifted over time toward contributions. By the early 1500s, the machinery had a traveling sales force, and its most famous salesman was a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel, born in Pirna in 1465, commissioned to move indulgences through Germany to help fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome. Tetzel came into a town with a procession, the papal bull carried ahead of him on velvet, and preached in the biggest church, and witnesses described his method, and his method was your dead parents. He told crowds their mothers and fathers were calling out to them from the flames. Contemporaries recorded him telling audiences the dead were crying, "We bore you, we fed you, we left you everything we had, and you are so cruel that you will not spend the little it would cost to release us." A jingle attached itself to him, and in English it goes, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." Now, on that jingle, the record is interesting. Nobody has found the couplet in anything Tetzel himself wrote, and Catholic historians have pointed out that the official documents authorized no such crude promise, and that the Sorbonne had rejected the underlying proposition twice, in 1482 and again in 1518. Against that, you have contemporaries reporting the preaching they heard, and you have a scholar of the period, Scott Hendricks, noting the claim that Tetzel said St. Peter himself could grant no greater grace than the indulgence on sale that day. And you have Martin Luther, who was hearing about all of it from parishioners walking back into Wittenberg with their certificates, attacking the coin and coffer idea directly in his 95 Theses in 1517. Whatever the paperwork technically authorized, the message received on the ground by the people handing over their coins was that money moves souls out of fire. Draw your own conclusion about the distance between the two. The people of the era drew theirs, and it split Christendom in half. One more piece of that machinery involves babies. And in years of making these videos, it is the saddest material I have handled. The doctrine on baptism was hard and clear. Unbaptized, unsaved. Augustine had fought that position through in the early 5th century against a monk named Pelagius, and Augustine's version 1. Infants are born carrying original sin, and an infant who dies before baptism dies in that sin. Late in his life, Augustine softened it barely, allowing that the punishment of such infants would be the mildest of pains, mitissima poena, but they were, in his account, punished. 8 centuries later, Thomas Aquinas pulled the doctrine somewhere gentler, a limbo of infants, no torment at all, a state of natural contentment, only forever shut out from the sight of God. The Church never dogmatically settled it. The one official document that even uses the word limbo came in 1794. So for the entire medieval period, a mother who lost a child before the christening was left with a range of expert opinion running from mild eternal pain to painless eternal exile, and no promise of heaven anywhere on the menu. Now put that doctrine into a world where something like 1 child in 4 died in the first year, where labor killed mothers and babies together with terrible regularity, where a baby could be born grey and still on a winter night with the church a half-day's walk away. Midwives were drilled in emergency baptism for exactly this reason, in the valid words, in the duty to perform the rite themselves, even mid-birth, if only a hand or the crown of the head had emerged, and the child looked likely to die. All of it official practice. A frightened woman in a bloody room saying the formula over a baby that was mostly not yet born, because the alternative was eternity. And when the baptism came too late or never came, the child could not lie in consecrated ground. Unbaptized babies were buried outside the churchyard or squeezed into the margins of it, the north side, the shadowed side, where the excluded went. And in plenty of places they were buried at night, quietly, without rite, as though the family had something to be ashamed of. Parents lived with that. They knew where their child lay, and they knew where their child was not allowed to lie, and the fence between the two was doctrine. Out of that grief grew one of the strangest practices of the entire Middle Ages, and I'd never heard of it before working on this video. From the 1400s onward, across the Alps and well beyond, there spread what are called respite sanctuaries, sanctuaires à repas in the French scholarship. Shrines, usually with a miraculous image of the Virgin, where parents carried dead infants, carried them for days sometimes, a little corpse wrapped and held against a body walking mountain roads. At the shrine, the child was laid before the image, and the parents and the attending clergy watched for a sign of life. A flush of colour in the dead face, a drop of blood, a feather laid on the lips, moving. The moment a sign appeared, the child was declared briefly, miraculously alive, baptized fast, and then allowed to die again, this time inside the church, saved, buriable in holy ground. The whole miracle window might last a minute, and a minute was the entire point. At Oberburen, in what's now Switzerland, one of these shrines became famous enough to draw enormous offerings. Tens of thousands of pounds by the count a reformer passed along to Zwingli before Protestant Bern wiped the site out around 1528. And when archaeologists excavated the place in 1997, they found the babies. Roughly 250 infants buried around the church. At Erzberg in Swabia, the reports claim some 600 dead newborns arrived in a single year. 600 sets of parents a year at one shrine, walking their dead child up a road because the alternative was a fence and an unmarked hole on the north side. The papacy eventually moved against the practice, Benedict XIV condemning the alleged signs of life from 1740 onward, and you can see his reasoning, and you can also see exactly why the practice existed, and both things can sit in your head at once. The church built the terror, ordinary people built the workaround. Grief will always find a road. So far, everything I've described works on the inside of a person, on conscience and grief, and the fear of what comes after. The church also had weapons that worked on the outside, on your standing among the living, and the sharpest of those was excommunication. The word gets used loosely now, but in the Middle Ages it had a precise and devastating content, and for the worst cases there was a full ceremony. The solemn anathema, the ritual people remember as bell, book, and candle. The form is attributed back to Pope Zachary in the mid-700s, and it was staged to be witnessed. Here is how it went. The bishop, vested in violet, the colour of penance and mourning, stands with 12 priests around him, each priest holding a lit candle. The name of the condemned is spoken, and then the bishop recites the sentence, and the surviving text of it is worth hearing at length, because nobody who heard it once ever forgot it. We separate him, together with his accomplices and abettors, from the precious body and blood of the Lord, and from the society of all Christians. We exclude him from our Holy Mother, the Church in heaven and on earth. We declare him excommunicate and anathema. We judge him damned, with the devil and his angels and all the reprobate, to eternal fire, until he shall recover himself from the toils of the devil and return to amendment and to penitence. The 12 priests answer together, "So be it, so be it, so be it." The bishop closes the book. A bell is tolled, the way a bell tolls for a death, and in a sense one had just occurred. And then the priests turn their candles over and dash them out against the ground. 12 small flames struck dead on the stones, standing in for a soul removed from the light of God. Letters went out afterward to the neighboring bishops, so the sentence would follow the man wherever he went. England kept a domestic cousin of the anathema that reached every pew. 4 times a year, parish priests recited the general sentence, the great curse, a long formal cursing of whole categories of offenders, tithe cheats, movers of boundary stones, forgers of the bishop's seal, those who struck their parents. The list running on at length while the congregation stood and listened, and every person standing there understood the categories were live, that anyone could walk into one by Michaelmas. Nobody needed a personal sentence from Rome. The parish version arrived on schedule, quarterly, like rent. What did it actually do to a life? Everything. An excommunicate could not receive any sacrament, no mass and no absolution, and so, under the theology we've been walking through, no protection whatsoever if he died. And dying in that world was never far away. He could not be buried in consecrated ground, and the living were commanded to cut him off. No one might share his table or his trade, or so much as greet him. His social existence was dismantled by decree. In feudal terms it went even deeper, because oaths sworn to an excommunicate lost their binding force, meaning a lord under anathema could watch his own vassals released from loyalty to him by a document from Rome. A peasant under anathema simply became a ghost in his own village, visible and untouchable, in the bad sense. People broke under it, and the church counted on their breaking. The sentence always came with the door left open a crack, until he shall return to penitence, and returning meant submission, public, often humiliating, on the church's terms. We'll see 2 kings walk through that door before this video is over, one of them barefoot in the snow. Excommunication struck one person. The interdict struck everyone, and England at the start of the 1200s shows it at full scale. The quarrel was between King John and Pope Innocent III, and it started over a job appointment of all things, the Archbishopric of Canterbury. The Pope backed a scholar named Stephen Langton. John refused him, absolutely, and would not bend, and Innocent reached for the biggest lever he had. On the 23rd of March 1208, a general interdict fell on England and Wales, and the sacramental life of an entire country stopped. On the ground it meant this: church doors closed and in some places were formally sealed, no mass anywhere, for anyone, no marriages solemnized in church, so couples stood in the porch, outside the locked building, to make their vows. No church bells. And I don't think we can easily recover how enormous that silence was, because bells structured the whole day of a medieval community, and now the towers just stood there mute, month over month, year over year. The interdict lasted more than 6 years. A child born in the spring of 1208 was old enough to work the harvest before England heard its bells again. 2 exceptions were allowed, and the choice of exceptions maps what the Church itself considered the irreducible minimum. Babies could still be baptized, and the dying could still make confession. Birth and death. Everything in between, the entire sacramental middle of life, was suspended, held hostage over a personnel dispute between a king and a pope, with several million people standing underneath it. The dead had it worst. Burial in consecrated ground was forbidden, and the chroniclers of the time recorded what that produced in language that has not softened with age. Roger of Wendover wrote that the bodies of the dead were carried out of the cities and towns and buried in roads and in ditches, without prayers and without the attendance of priests. Ditches. Ralph of Coggeshall, a Cistercian describing an interdict's effects, wrote of the sealed doors of the churches, Christians shut out from entry as though they were dogs, and of the bodies of the dead denied Christian burial, whose stink infected the air. Families were digging holes in field margins for their parents. People who had spent their whole lives being taught that unconsecrated burial imperiled the soul now had no other option, and they had done nothing. The ordinary dead of England during those 6 years had committed no offence. Their souls were collateral in a negotiation, and people improvised in ways that break your heart a little when you find them in the record. Some families buried their dead in unconsecrated ground and kept the spot marked, planning to move the bones into the churchyard whenever the interdict lifted, holding a grave in escrow. Chroniclers noted the small absurdities too, corpses carried toward dioceses rumoured to sit outside the sentence, quiet payments for a whispered blessing over a field grave, the whole shadow economy of consolation that springs up wherever consolation is banned. Some carried dying relatives long distances toward any place rumoured to have kept some ministry going. The fear did not pause for politics. Only the relief did. John, for his part, discovered that the interdict suited him financially. With church offices vacant and clergy in exile, he took church revenues into his own hands, and by the standard modern accounting, he pulled in more than £100,000 from vacant and appropriated sees and abbeys, an astronomical sum for the period. The Pope escalated, excommunicating John personally in 1209, and eventually the threat of a French invasion with papal blessing did what 6 years of his subjects' misery had not. John submitted in 1213, accepted Langton, and went further, surrendering the kingdom itself to the papacy and receiving it back as a fief. England technically a papal possession, with tribute owed. The interdict was formally lifted on the 2nd of July 1214, once compensation to the Church was arranged, 100,000 marks in reparations. The bells came back, the doors opened, and 6 years of the dead stayed where they had been put, in the roads and the ditches, and every parish in England knew exactly which of its people lay outside the wall. That question, who lies inside the wall and who lies outside it, ran through the whole medieval world, interdict or no interdict, and it brings me to the people who were shut out permanently. Suicides above all. The theology was merciless on its own terms. Self-killing was murder. Murder requires repentance for forgiveness. And the dead cannot repent, so the person who died by their own hand died, by definition, in unforgiven mortal sin. No funeral, no consecrated ground. And in England, the customary treatment went beyond mere exclusion into something that looks a great deal like ritual punishment of a corpse. Burial at a crossroads, at night, no priest, no mourners in any formal sense, and in many recorded cases a wooden stake driven down through the body, pinning it into the earth. The stated logics varied, that the crossroads would confuse a restless spirit, that the stake would hold it down. The practice was local and uneven, more custom than statute, but it was real, and it lasted an astonishingly long time. The last recorded crossroads burial of a suicide in London took place in 1823. A young man named Abel Griffiths put into the ground where Grosvenor Place meets the King's Road, and the public disgust around that case helped push Parliament into finally outlawing the custom that same year, 1823. Medieval fear had a very long tail. The property of a suicide was forfeit too, in England, seized by the Crown, so a family lost the person, lost the funeral, lost the grave, and then lost the household goods, and carried the stigma afterward. Grief was fined. And the same churchyard geography that exiled suicides sorted everyone else as well. The north side for the unbaptized and the excommunicate and the executed. The honoured ground near the church walls and the east for the worthy. Even in death, especially in death, everyone was ranked, and everyone standing at a graveside could see the ranking with their own eyes. Between the great set-piece punishments, the everyday machinery hummed along quietly, and honestly it may have shaped more lives than all the fires put together. Start with confession. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council made annual confession to your own parish priest mandatory for every Christian above the age of discretion, on pain of being barred from church and denied Christian burial. Every adult in Europe, once a year at minimum, alone with the one man in the village who answered to the bishop, itemizing their sins out loud, down to the last stray thought. The priest was bound to secrecy, and the seal of confession was taken seriously, and still, the position this created in a community of 100 souls was extraordinary. One man knew everything about everyone. He knew which marriages were quietly broken, who had cheated whom on a land boundary, which young woman's confession had gotten complicated in the spring. He granted or withheld absolution, and he watched them all across the churchyard every Sunday afterward, knowing. Even administered honestly, and it often was administered honestly, the structure of it was surveillance. Administered dishonestly, it was a weapon, and a priest in a village in the Pyrenees, later in this video, will show the confessional working as both a hunting ground and an intelligence service. The church also ran its own courts, and their jurisdiction reached deep into the private lives of ordinary people, marriage, wills, tithes, sexual behavior, blasphemy, working on a Sunday, missing services. Punishment for the ordinary run of offences was public penance, and the standard form in England became a specific piece of theatre. The offender stood before the whole congregation, or walked ahead of the procession, barefoot, bareheaded, wrapped in a white sheet, carrying a lit candle, and confessed the offence aloud to the people they lived beside, and would go on living beside for the rest of their lives. For a market town adulterer, that might happen on 3 consecutive Sundays, and possibly once in the marketplace on market day for good measure. Ask yourself which you dread more, a fine or standing in a sheet in front of every person you know while your sin is announced. Shame was the cheapest instrument the church owned, and it never wore out. Those with money could sometimes buy their way past the sheet, the penance commuted to a payment toward the church fabric or the poor, and everyone in the parish noticed exactly who stood barefoot in white and who settled quietly at the archdeacon's table. Even humiliation had a price list. Tithes ran underneath everything, 1/10 of your produce, your grain, your lambs, your wool, owed to the church, collected with the full backing of those courts, and, behind the courts, of excommunication. Preachers told stories about tithe cheats struck down, about the withheld sheaf that cursed the whole barn. Payment was framed as a debt to God, and the man who shorted God was gambling with the only thing he had that lasted. Most people paid. Most people, to be fair, believed, and paying was part of believing. But the enforcement structure existed, and every so often it showed its teeth, and one flash of teeth per generation per village was generally enough. All of that, the confession, the courts, the sheet, the tithe barn, dealt with sinners, and sinners were the ordinary business of the church, manageable and even profitable. Heretics were a different category altogether. A sinner breaks the law of God. A heretic, in the medieval framing, attacks the law itself, spreads, infects, and the language the church used about heresy was consistently the language of disease, plague, rot in the body of Christ. And you do not negotiate with rot, you cut it out, and you burn what you cut. Which carries us into the darkest stretch of this whole story, the machinery built for hunting human beings, and it starts with a man whose name deserves to be better known than it is, as a warning. Conrad of Marburg. Conrad was a priest of the early 1200s, learned ascetic to the point of self-destruction, and famous first as a confessor, specifically as the confessor and spiritual director of Elizabeth of Hungary, the young widowed Landgravine of Thuringia, who would later be canonized as a saint. His direction of Elizabeth is the whole man in preview, years before he held an inquisitor's commission. He beat her. That's in the record from her own attendants, testimony gathered for her canonization, that Conrad struck her and her maids with rods for infractions of his rules, that blows he ordered left marks lasting weeks. He dismissed the companions she loved and separated her from her children. This was spiritual direction as domination, applied to a woman the church itself would soon declare holy, and the church knew about it, and it promoted him. In 1227, Pope Gregory IX commissioned Conrad to root out heresy in Germany, and Conrad went at the work like a man given permission for something he had wanted his whole life. He rode circuit with 2 assistants who deserve their own mention, a converted heretic called Conrad Dorso, and a one-handed, one-eyed layman known as Johannes, John the One-Eyed. Neither of them trained in law or theology, both of them enthusiastic. The method this little tribunal settled on was brutally simple. An accusation equaled guilt. The accused got a choice: confess and prove the confession's sincerity by naming other heretics, or refuse and burn. That was the whole procedure. Confession saved your life and required you to feed the machine more names, so the machine never ran out of names, each trial seeding the next 10. People confessed to things that had never happened, invented midnight gatherings and devils, described whatever the questioners themselves had planted in the questions, and named neighbors, and the neighbors, facing the same choice, named more. Panic moved ahead of him like weather. Reports describe entire districts in terror at the news that Conrad was coming, because everyone understood that innocence had no procedural value whatsoever. He burned people of every rank. He burned a provost of Goslar, Heinrich Minneke, after a proceeding nobody would dignify as a trial. And in 1233 he finally reached too high, accusing Henry III, Count of Seine, of participating in satanic rites. The Count demanded a proper hearing before an assembly of bishops and princes at Mainz in July of 1233, and refused to be judged by Conrad's method. And the assembly declined to convict without evidence, and you can feel the whole German establishment exhaling at once. Finally, a wall. Conrad responded by calling for a crusade against the nobles themselves. 5 days after the Mainz hearing, on the 30th of July, 1233, he was ambushed on the road near Marburg and cut down, along with a companion. Knights of the region are the usual suspects, and no one was ever seriously punished for it. Gregory IX demanded justice for his murdered inquisitor. The German bishops, closer to the ground, put on record their own verdict on the dead man's career, and it was not flattering. Conrad was the raw version, one fanatic with unlimited discretion and bodies behind him. What the Church built over the following decades was the refined version, the same fire with paperwork around it, and the paperwork is somehow more chilling than the fanatic. The refined version was the medieval Inquisition proper. Papal inquisitors, mostly Dominicans and Franciscans, dispatched from the 1230s onward, above all into the south of France against the Cathars, and its procedures inverted almost everything we would recognize as justice. You could be denounced in secret, and you were never told who had denounced you. 2 witnesses sufficed, and categories of witness barred from every other kind of court: criminals, the excommunicated, other accused heretics testifying to save themselves, were welcomed in heresy cases, because heresy was deemed so dangerous that the ordinary safeguards were a luxury the faith could not afford. You had no meaningful right to counsel, since any lawyer defending an obvious heretic risked prosecution as a supporter of heresy, a rule that emptied the defense benches overnight, and the entire process aimed at one output: confession, framed as your spiritual rescue. The Inquisitor sincerely understood himself as a doctor of souls. You were sick. The interrogation was the treatment. On the 15th of May, 1252, the treatment acquired its most infamous instrument. Pope Innocent IV issued the bull Ad Extirpanda, and among its provisions, it directed the secular authorities to torture accused heretics into confessing and into naming their accomplices. The bull came in a season of fury, a few weeks after the assassination of the Inquisitor Peter of Verona, who had been ambushed on the road from Como to Milan by hired killers, a billhook driven into his skull, and pious tradition grew up that as he lay dying, he traced the opening of the creed in his own blood on the ground. Peter was canonized inside a year, the fastest canonization on record, and the bull avenged him structurally. Its reasoning called heretics murderers of souls and thieves of the sacraments of God, and its restraint, such as it was, came in one clause. The torture must stop short of death and short of destroying a limb, citra membri, diminutionem et mortis periculum. Everything up to that line was available, and a body offers a great deal of territory up to that line. Inquisitors also faced a formal rule that torture could be applied only once, and they found a solution of perfect bad faith. A torture session could be suspended and continued later, and the continuation counted legally as part of the same single application, and so once could stretch across as many days as the questioners had patience for. When a rule inconveniences you, define the rule. Confessions extracted under torture had to be repeated afterward, freely, away from the instruments, to count. And the record duly describes prisoners confirming, freely and without coercion, the things they had screamed the day before, with everyone in the room understanding that a retraction meant the room again. The men who ran this system wrote manuals, and the manuals survive, and they are stranger and colder than any atrocity story. Bernard Gui, Inquisitor of Toulouse for a decade and a half in the early 1300s, compiled his Practica around 1324, a professional handbook covering the beliefs of each heretical sect, the evasions their members typically attempted under questioning, and the counter-moves an experienced interrogator should deploy. He writes about the verbal fencing almost with connoisseurship, the suspect who answers a question with a question, who swears in ambiguous formulas, who plays simple. Gui's registers survive too, and the totals give you the shape of the enterprise. Across his career, he pronounced somewhere over 600 convictions. Of those, roughly 40 ended at the stake. The rest received the wider menu, imprisonment ranging up to the murus strictus, the harsh wall, meaning chains in a cell on bread and water for life, and pilgrimages, and the punishment that marked more bodies than any other, the yellow crosses. Large felt crosses sewn onto the outer clothing, front and back, to be worn for years or for life. Everyone in the street could see what you had been, and so could your children's prospective in-laws. It was an excommunication you wore, permanent and visible at 50 paces, and people begged, actually petitioned the tribunals to have the crosses removed because the crosses were slowly strangling their lives. And the tribunals reached past death. This detail stops most people. If evidence emerged that a person now deceased had died a heretic, the Inquisition tried the corpse. A dead man could be convicted, and upon conviction his remains were dug out of consecrated ground, and the bones were dragged through the streets, sometimes with a crier announcing the name and the crime, and burned on a public pyre, and the dead man's property was confiscated retroactively, which could ruin his heirs a generation after the fact. Families thus had a live financial interest in the orthodoxy of their grandparents. The past itself was placed under surveillance. I genuinely cannot think of another legal system that prosecuted the dead this systematically, and burned them, and made the grandchildren pay the costs. What all this apparatus felt like from underneath, inside a single small community, survives in one of the most extraordinary documents of the entire Middle Ages, an inquisitor's register kept nearly complete. Jacques Fournier, Bishop of Pamiers in the foothills of the Pyrenees, ran his own inquisition between 1318 and 1325, aimed largely at the last Cathar believers in the high villages. Above all, a place called Montaillou, a mountain settlement of perhaps 200 people. Fournier was patient and obsessive, and unlike most inquisitors, he wanted the actual back and forth written down in full, whole testimonies, word for word. His register ended up in the Vatican Library because Fournier ended up Pope Benedict XII, elected in 1334. The manuscript sat there for 6 centuries until the historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie built a famous book out of it in the 1970s. And through it you can hear medieval peasants talking at length in their own words about their beds and their lice and their cheeses and their heresies, the only reason we can hear them being that every one of them was talking under threat. Montaillou, under Fournier's lens, turns out to be a village where the church's local representative, the parish priest Pierre Clergue, was simultaneously the most active Cathar sympathizer in the district, the most prolific seducer, and, when it suited his family's feuds, an informer to the very Inquisition hunting his own flock. He took mistresses across the village and beyond, at least a dozen that the testimony names, among them the former chatelaine, a noblewoman called Béatrice de Planisole, whose interrogation runs through the register in astonishing intimacy, her love affairs, the folk magic she kept wrapped in linen. He heard these women's confessions. The man receiving your sins in the confessional was the man committing half of them with you, and also the man who could denounce you, and in several cases he did denounce people, and they went to the bishop's prison at Pamiers on his word. Fournier summoned 98 accused before him across those years, a large share of them from Montaillou and the villages around it, down the mountain to face a bishop who never hurried, and who circled back to the inconsistency in what you had said 4 months earlier. Most were peasants and shepherds. One shepherd, Pierre Maury, wanders through the record as a decent, generous, doomed man who could never quite bring himself to abandon either his heretic friends or his own good nature, and the machine got him in the end. Beatrice was sentenced to prison and then released to wear the yellow crosses. Clerg himself died in the bishop's prison. A handful from that region were burned, among them the last known Cathar prefect of the area, Guillaume Bélibaste, lured back across the mountains by a paid traitor and burned at Villarouge-Termenès around 1321. The register even preserves the small home rituals of the village dead, families clipping hair and fingernails from a corpse to keep the house's luck from leaving with the body. Fournier wrote it all down. Everything went in the file. The true innovation of the whole system was the file, the patient, permanent, searchable memory of an institution that never forgot anything about anyone, a tribunal your grandchildren might still be answering to. The Cathars Fournier was mopping up in the 1320s were the survivors of survivors, the last embers of a faith that had once held whole towns across the south of France. And to see how it came to embers, you have to go back a century to the largest single act of religious violence in medieval Europe, the Albigensian Crusade. In 1209, Pope Innocent III, the same pope who would lay England under interdict, proclaimed a crusade with full crusading privileges, remission of sins, protection of property, the whole package, aimed at Christians inside Christendom, the heretics of Languedoc, and the nobles who tolerated them. An army gathered in the north, tens of thousands strong, including the armed pilgrims and the camp followers, and marched south down the Rhône in high summer, and the first great city in its path was Béziers. Béziers was a walled town on a hill above the river Aube, prosperous and, in fact, mostly Catholic, with a Cathar minority its Catholic neighbours had declined to hand over. The bishop of the town carried a list of about 200 names out to the Crusader camp and brought back an offer: surrender the people on the list and be spared. The townsmen refused. Whatever they thought of their heretics, they would not sell them, and they trusted their walls, and the walls should have held for weeks, long enough for the August heat to start rotting a besieging army from the inside. On the 22nd of July, 1209, the feast day, as it happens, of Mary Magdalene, some of the town's defenders made a sortie out of a gate to jeer at the camp, and the camp's lowest element, the ribauds, the servants and mercenaries and unarmed rabble, boys with clubs some of them, surged back through that gate before it could close, and the town fell in an afternoon, before the knights had even fully armed. What followed had no plan, and then had no limit. The population ran for the churches because that was the deepest instinct in Christendom: sanctuary, holy ground. No one kills on holy ground. Thousands packed into the Cathedral of Saint-Nazaire and the Church of Mary Magdalene, women, children, the old, the priests among them. The bells rung, some accounts say, until the end. The Crusaders killed everyone. Inside the churches, inside the church of the saint whose feast day it was. The chronicler closest to the leadership, Peter of Les Vaux de Cernay, put 7,000 dead in the Magdalene church alone, a figure the building could barely hold standing. So treat the number as a chronicler's gesture at something he had no vocabulary to count. And the papal legate commanding the crusade, Arnaud Amalric, abbot of Citeaux, wrote his own report to Innocent, and his words survive: "Our men spared no one, irrespective of rank, sex or age, and put to the sword almost 20,000 people." Then, this from the legate, the abbot, to the pope: God's vengeance raged wonderfully. The line everyone knows from Béziers comes from a different pen. The Cistercian Caesarius of Heisterbach, writing some years later up in the Rhineland, tells it that when the town was breaking, soldiers asked Amalric how they could tell Catholics from heretics, and the abbot answered, "Kill them, for the Lord knows those that are his." Caesarius flags it himself with the Latin "Dixis effertur," he is reported to have said. So even our source is passing along what people were repeating, and historians have argued ever since about whether the abbot spoke those words on that day. Set the quotation wherever you like on the scale of certainty. The conduct it describes is not in dispute, and the man it describes signed his own body count, and the phrase spread through Europe with no recorded embarrassment from anyone on the crusade, and what a movement lets stand as its own legend can say as much as any document. The town was torched so thoroughly that the burning cathedral cracked and came down on the dead inside it. The army moved on. Every town in Languedoc had now heard what refusal meant, and the next several places on the road opened their gates without a fight. Fear, though, has to be maintained, and the new military commander of the crusade, Simon de Montfort, understood maintenance. In the spring of 1210, his forces took the village of Bram after a short siege, and Montfort staged a message with the prisoners. He took 100 or so of the defenders and had their eyes put out and their noses and upper lips cut off, cut back to the teeth, and he left one man a single eye, one eye in the whole column, and that man, holding a rope or a shoulder, walked the rest of them, a file of mutilated blind men roped together, across country to the fortress of Cabaret, the next place on the list, so that Cabaret's defenders could stand on their own walls and watch what came walking up the road toward them. Contemporaries record it without much flinching, and Montfort's admirers explained it as answering atrocities from the other side, which was a real feature of this war. The arrival needs no embellishment. Sentries on a wall, a slow column on the road below, and then the moment the details resolve. Minerve came that same summer, a town on a gorge, its water supply covered by a fortified well, and Montfort's engineers built a great trebuchet the army nicknamed Malvoisin, bad neighbor, and pounded the well path until the town's water died in the June heat, and Minerve surrendered on terms in July of 1210. The terms spared everyone willing to return to the church. Inside the town were about 140 Cathar perfect, the celibate, vegetarian, sworn elite of the faith, and they were offered their lives for a conversion, and nearly all of them refused, and a great fire was built in the gorge, and here the record preserves a detail I have never been able to shake. The soldiers did not have to force many of them. Contemporary accounts describe the perfect walking into the fire on their own, some of them without being dragged, 3 women held back at the last moment by a noblewoman who pulled them physically from the flame's edge and had them reconciled. The rest burned. The army watched people step into a bonfire rather than say a sentence, and if the Crusaders took a lesson from that, the record doesn't say what it was. A year on came Lavore, in May of 1211, and Lavore was the worst of these set pieces all in one place. The town was held by a noble widow, Geralda de Laurac, together with her brother Aymery de Montreal, and Geralda's reputation in the local sources, including sources hostile to her faith, was for open-handed charity, a woman no poor traveller left hungry. The town fell on the 3rd of May after a hard siege. Aymery and around 80 of his knights were sentenced to hang, and the mass gallows was thrown up so hastily that it collapsed under the first hangings, under Aymery's own hanging by some accounts, and Montfort, rather than rebuild it, had the remaining knights' throats cut where they stood. Then 300 to 400 Cathar perfect and believers, the largest single burning of the whole crusade, were taken to a meadow outside the walls and burned together. And Peter of Les Vaux de Cernay, the Crusade's own chronicler, a monk travelling with the army, recorded that our crusaders burned them with immense joy. His phrase, cum ingenti gaudio, and Geralda, the lady of the town, was handed to the soldiers, and the soldiers threw her down a well, alive, and stoned her, heaving rocks down the shaft until the noise stopped, and even the Crusade's friendly chroniclers relate her death with a hitch in the prose, one of them making a point of her generosity in the same breath. She had led no army. Her offence was her family, her faith, and her town, and her killing had no judicial dress on it at all, just soldiers, a woman, and a hole in the ground. The war ground on for another generation, the North swallowing the South piece by piece, and the faith it had come to kill went up into the mountains, and the mountains, in the end, came down to one rock, Montségur, a fortress on a limestone peak in the Pyrenean foothills, reachable by one brutal path, and by the 1240s it had become the last open sanctuary of Catharism, a few hundred people on a summit, the bishops of the faith, the perfect, their families, and a small garrison of knights who had lost everything else. After Cathar sympathizers from the fortress helped murder a party of inquisitors in their beds at Avignonnet in 1242, the crown and the church decided the rock would come down, and a royal army arrived in May of 1243 and settled in for a siege that would last some 10 months, through the whole Pyrenean winter, hired Basque climbers eventually hauling a stone thrower up the cliffs to a ledge where no attacking force was supposed to be able to stand, the stones after that falling on the fortress day and night. In March of 1244, the defenders negotiated. The terms were, by the standards of everything I've described so far, remarkably gentle, and that gentleness sets up one of the most haunting recorded decisions of the Middle Ages. Everyone in the fortress would go free, the garrison included, sins of the war forgiven, on one condition: renounce the heresy. Only those who refused to abjure would burn, and the defenders asked for, and were granted, a 2-week truce before the handover. 2 weeks, 14 days on a freezing summit to decide, individually, person by person, whether you would say the words and walk down the mountain into the rest of your life, or refuse and burn. The perfect were always going to refuse. Their vows held them, and they spent the fortnight in fasting and prayer. What nobody on the crown's side expected was the direction of movement during those 14 days. Ordinary members of the garrison, fighting men and wives, and at least one mother alongside her daughter, asked to receive the consolamentum, the Cathar sacrament of initiation, in that final week, knowing with total clarity that receiving it converted their free pass into a death sentence. Around 20 people did this. They had the exit in their hands and they set it down. Soldiers who had held the walls all winter chose the fire over the walk down, and the perfect they joined gave away their remaining possessions in those last days: grain, wax, a pouch of pepper, small legacies to the friends who were going to live. On the 16th of March 1244, they came down the path, somewhere over 200 of them, the old Bishop Bertrand Marty among them, and at the foot of the mountain the army had built a palisade packed with pitch and straw, one enclosure, because 200 individual stakes was more carpentry than anyone had patience for. The prisoners were shoved inside it, the injured carried, some accounts say thrown, and it was lit, and 200 and some human beings burned together in one pen, while the army and their own spared neighbours stood in the meadow. The field below the peak carries a name in Occitan to this day, the Prat dels Cremats, the field of the burned. A modern stone stands there now with an inscription to the Cathars, to the martyrs of pure Christian love, and hikers coming down off the peak walk past it, most of them, I'd guess, without knowing they are crossing an execution ground with a body count in the hundreds. Fire for the stubborn then, for the powerful, the church usually preferred theatre. And 2 performances above all show how completely it could bring even kings to their knees, sometimes literally, and the first of them happened at a castle gate in the Apennines in the dead of winter. In 1076, King Henry IV of Germany had tried to depose Pope Gregory VII, and Gregory had answered with the weapon we already know, excommunication, and had gone further, releasing Henry's subjects from their oaths, and within a year Henry's own princes were circling, and the king understood that his crown now depended on absolution. So, in January of 1077, he crossed the Alps in one of the harshest winters in memory, his party at points crawling on hands and knees over the ice of the Mont Cenis Pass, his queen and infant son carried down slopes in ox hides used as sledges, and presented himself outside the castle of Canossa, where the Pope was staying, as a penitent. We have Gregory's own account written days later in a letter to the German princes, and by the Pope's telling, Henry came to the gate barefoot, in wool, in the snow, and stood there begging absolution with tears, and continued to do so for 3 days, the gate staying shut. The king of the Germans standing in a courtyard in January, while the man inside decided when misery had accumulated sufficiently. Chroniclers like Lambert of Hersfeld fill in the freezing detail, and later retellings polished the scene further, and you can hold the core as solid, the barefoot penance, the 3 days, the shut gate, attested by the Pope's own pen within the week. On the 3rd day the gate opened, Henry was admitted, absolved, and given communion by the Pope's own hand. The politics rolled on afterward. Henry recovered. The 2 men fought for years more, but the image had escaped into permanent circulation. An emperor-to-be, barefoot in snow, waiting 3 days on a priest's pleasure, and going to Canossa is still, 1,000 years later, a phrase in several languages for total surrender. A century after that, an English king went further than standing in snow. Henry II's knights had butchered Archbishop Thomas Becket in his own cathedral at Canterbury in December of 1170. 4 swordsmen opening his skull on the pavement near the altar, the crown of his head sliced away and, by the monk's account, his brains scattered on the stones with the flat of a blade. And though the king had not ordered it in so many words, everyone in Europe held his temper responsible, and the murdered archbishop's tomb began working miracles almost immediately, and canonization came within 3 years, and Henry spent those years under threat of excommunication and politically drowning. In July of 1174, with a rebellion of his own sons burning and a Scottish army over the border, Henry decided the saint had to be squared, and squared publicly. On the 12th of July he approached Canterbury, dismounted outside the city, stripped to a plain wool shirt, and walked barefoot through the streets to the cathedral. And the streets of a medieval city were not kind to bare feet, and observers noted the blood he left on the paving. At the tomb in the crypt he prostrated himself, and then the King of England took off his cloak, put his head and shoulders into the tomb niche among the pilgrims' crawl space, and submitted to a flogging, 5 strokes of the rod from each bishop and abbot present, and then 3 strokes from each of the monks of the cathedral priory, and the priory had on the order of 80 monks. Well over 200 strokes across the royal back, delivered in turn by men filing past, some of whom had personally loved the man his knights had cut down. The chronicler William of Newburgh records the scene, corporally beaten with rods by all the brethren in succession. And then Henry stayed. He spent the whole night in the crypt, fasting, on the bare stone beside the tomb, and would not let anyone so much as spread a carpet. And in the morning he heard Mass, drank water tinctured with the martyr's blood, the cathedral's specialty relic drink, and rode away. Word reached him within days that on the very morning after his penance, his forces had captured the King of Scots at Alnwick, and all of England took the timing as the saint's receipt, payment accepted, and as royal theatre. You could not have scripted it better, and plenty of people ever since have quietly wondered whether somebody did. The sources give no purchase for that suspicion. Sometimes the dice just land. Kings doing penance made for good theatre in ordinary times. Then came a time with nothing ordinary in it at all, and the whole architecture of religious fear I've been describing was hit with more raw material than it could process. The Black Death reached the Mediterranean ports in 1347, and swept the continent over the following 4 years, and current estimates put the dead at somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe. Half. In some towns, more. And the Church's explanation, the only explanation its framework had available, was the one it had always given for catastrophe: sin. God's patience had run out. The pestilence was the rod, and the rod would keep falling until the sin stopped. Under that explanation, the plague became a spiritual emergency on top of a medical one, and the spiritual emergency had a specific, agonizing edge, because dying of plague usually meant dying fast in a house everyone else had fled, and the priests were dying faster than anyone. Clergy who did their duty sat with the infected and caught it, and clerical mortality in some regions ran higher than the general populations, and the survivors could not cover the ground. So people faced the thing they had been trained their whole lives to dread above everything, dying unshriven, with no confession and no last rites, the full ledger still open. The Bishop of Bath and Wells, Ralph of Shrewsbury, issued a letter in January 1349 that measures the desperation exactly, instructing that if no priest could be found, the dying should make their confession to a layman, and, the bishop wrote, if no man is present, then even to a woman. The Church was improvising exits from its own theology in real time, because the alternative was millions of its people dying in certified terror. And the burials collapsed too, plague pits, bodies stacked in layers like, one Florentine chronicler said, lasagna, a comparison I truly wish he had kept to himself. And everything the Church had taught about the individual grave in holy ground with its rites went into the pit with them. Out of this came the flagellants, and if you want a single image for a civilization's fear turning physical, they are it. The movement had older roots in Italy, but in 1349 it exploded across Germany. The Low Countries and beyond, organized companies of men, dozens to hundreds at a time, marching from town to town on a fixed program, 33.5 days, one day, in one arrangement of the symbolism for every year of Christ's life on earth. Joining had conditions. A recruit confessed every sin committed since the age of 7 and swore obedience to a lay master, carried money enough to feed himself so the company begged nothing, and gave up bathing, beds, and every word to any woman for the whole 33.5 days. Twice a day they performed. The company would file into a town square, strip to the waist and a linen skirt, form a great circle, and throw themselves to the ground in postures declaring their sins, the adulterer face down, the perjurer with fingers raised, and the master walked among them thrashing each in turn, and then the mass scourging began. Every man on his own back and chest, in rhythm, singing hymns, and the instrument was not symbolic. Robert of Avesbury, a careful record-keeper of the Canterbury court, who watched a company of over 600 flagellants perform in London around Michaelmas of 1349, describes the scourge precisely: 3 tails, a knot in each tail, and sharp nails fixed through the knots. Iron points driven into the same torn skin at every session, twice daily, for a month. And observers describe backs opened into swollen, blue-black ruin, and men needing the points worked out of the muscle where a stroke had lodged them. The crowds pressed closer. Jean Froissart records women holding out cloths to catch the flying blood and pressing the blood to their eyes as a holy thing, and one chronicle describes townsfolk dipping cloths where it pooled, because the flagellants preached that their blood ran with Christ's, that this marching penance was holding off the end of the world, and to a population watching half its neighbours die, that was the only offer of agency on the table. A Dominican, Henry of Hereford, watched the iron do its work and wrote that a man would need a heart of stone to watch it without tears. For a few months the flagellants were more compelling than the Church itself, and the Church noticed. These were laymen running mass rituals of salvation with no priest anywhere in the chain, hearing, in effect, one another's confessions, and their preaching turned openly hostile to a clergy it painted as corrupt and useless, and worse than all of that put together, the companies became carriers of murder. On the 20th of October, 1349, Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in a formal bull, and among his charges was one specific and completely accurate accusation that the flagellants had shed the blood of Jews. Secular authorities turned on the companies. Masters were seized. Some were burned. The movement collapsed within a couple of years as fast as it had risen. On the Jews, though, Clement's bull was chasing a horror already accomplished in the Rhineland, and what happened there is as dark as anything in this entire video. As the plague spread, so did an explanation for it that fit the moment's paranoia better than either sin or bad air. The story that the wells were poisoned and that the poisoners were the Jews. Confessions supporting the story were produced under torture in the autumn of 1348 at Chillon on Lake Geneva, and the transcripts travelled up the Rhine from council to council, like the plague's own courier. Massacres followed the transcripts. At Basel in January 1349, the Jewish community was herded into a wooden house built for the purpose on an island in the Rhine and burned in it. At Strasbourg, the city's own leadership initially held the line, the Ammeister and Stettmeisters arguing the accusation was nonsense, and for their trouble they were deposed in a coup on the 9th and 10th of February 1349 by the guilds and patricians, and the new council gave the mob its answer. On Saturday, the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, 1349, before the plague had even properly arrived in the city, the Jews of Strasbourg were taken out to their own cemetery, where a wooden platform, effectively a giant scaffold for burning, had been prepared, and they were burned on it en masse. The chronicler Jakob Twinger von Königshofen, a Strasbourg priest writing within living memory, sets the number at about 2,000, and adds the detail that those who accepted baptism were spared, and that many small children were pulled out of the fire and baptized over their parents' protests. Children lifted out of the flames that were consuming their mothers and fathers, and carried off into new Christian lives. And the account then delivers one of the coldest sentences any medieval chronicler ever wrote about his own city. The money, Twinger observes, was the poison that killed the Jews, for the debts owed to them were cancelled and their property was divided among the burghers, and if the Jews had been poor, he says flatly, they would not have been burned. Modern historians put the Strasbourg dead anywhere from several hundred up to Twinger's 2,000, and they count roughly 1,000 Jewish communities across Europe destroyed in the plague years, Mainz's great community among them, where the accounts describe Jews fighting back, and then whole families dying in their burning houses. And through all of it, the papacy itself said no. Clement VI issued bulls in 1348 protecting the Jews, pointing out with plain logic that Jews were dying of the plague like everyone else, and that the pestilence raged in lands with no Jews at all, and ordering clergy to shield them. Whoever was listening to the Pope that year, it was not the Rhineland. The fear the Church had spent centuries cultivating had learned to run on its own, and when it ran at the nearest outsider, and no bull could call it back. Numbers in the thousands go abstract on us. The stake never went abstract for the person tied to it, and a handful of individual deaths are documented closely enough that we can stand in the crowd, so the next stretch of this video belongs to them. The first was a woman most people have never heard of, and she died in Paris 4 decades before the plague. Marguerite Porete was a Béguine, one of those lay religious women of the Low Countries who lived in devotion without taking a nun's vows, and she wrote a book in French rather than Latin, deliberately, so ordinary people could take it in, called The Mirror of Simple Souls, a work of mysticism about the soul so annihilated in the love of God that it needs nothing, in the end, not even the mediation of the Church. You can see the problem the authorities had with that last part. The book was condemned and publicly burned in front of her at Valenciennes, and she was ordered to stop circulating it, and she kept circulating it, and in 1308 she was arrested and brought before the Inquisitor of France. And then Marguerite did something that still radiates off the documents 7 centuries later. She stopped talking. For 1.5 years in prison, she refused to answer her judges at all, refused the oath, refused the whole premise that these men had standing over her soul, and the trial had to proceed around her silence, theologians condemning extracted propositions from a book whose author would not dignify the process with a word. On the 1st of June, 1310, she was burned in the Place de Grève, the square in front of where the Hôtel de Ville stands now, and a chronicler records that her bearing at the stake, her calm, moved the watching crowd to tears. Her book survived her, copied anonymously for centuries, translated, circulated among the devout, and only in 1946 did a scholar finally reconnect the much-loved anonymous text with the woman burned for writing it. People had been praying with a condemned heretic's book for 600 years without knowing her name. 4 years after Marguerite's fire, and a few hundred meters away, the same square mile of Paris saw the end of a much more famous case, and this one shows the machinery of religious terror being borrowed, essentially at gunpoint, by a king. Philip IV of France was magnificent, ruthless, and broke, and the Knights Templar were the richest religious order in his kingdom, bankers to half of Europe, answerable only to the Pope. Before dawn on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, sealed orders opened all across France simultaneously, and every Templar the crown could reach, thousands of men, most of them elderly administrative brothers and farm managers rather than warrior monks, was arrested in a single morning. The charges came from the standard heresy shelf that initiates denied Christ, spat on the cross, exchanged obscene kisses, worshipped an idol. And then the confessions came, and they came by torture, and the torture of the Templars is unusually well documented because some of the survivors later described it to papal commissioners. Men were racked, men were hung by weights, and the fire method appears in testimony with a detail that stays with everyone who encounters it. A priest of the order, Bernard de Vado, told the commissioners that his feet had been held over burning coals until the flesh cooked off them, and that bones fell from his feet in the days afterward. And he brought the bones with him and showed the commissioners, holding out the pieces of his own feet as exhibits. Under handling like that, the Templars confessed to whatever was put in front of them, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay included, an old soldier in his 60s who broke and admitted the denial of Christ within days of arrest. The confessions were the whole game, because a confession, once given, could not be safely taken back. Under inquisitorial rules, retracting a confession made you a relapsed heretic, and relapse meant fire without further discussion. In May 1310, 54 Templars who had dared to revoke their confessions and stand up to defend their order were taken outside Paris and burned in a single day, and eyewitness accounts say they screamed their innocence out of the fires, and the burnings did exactly what they were designed to do. The order's collective defense collapsed as hundreds of imprisoned brothers concluded that their coerced confessions were the only thing keeping them alive. The Pope dissolved the order in 1312. And in March 1314, on a scaffold in front of Notre Dame, Jacques de Molay and 3 other senior officers were brought out to have their life sentences confirmed publicly, broken old men, 7 years in chains, and the ceremony went off script. Molay stepped forward and told the crowd, in effect, none of it was true. The order was innocent. His confession was a lie he had bought his life with, and he was done paying. The prelates hustled the prisoners away, but the crown moved faster than the church, and Philip had Molay and his preceptor of Normandy, Geoffroy de Charnay, burned that same evening as relapsed heretics. No trial, on a small island in the Seine, the Île aux Juifs. Accounts describe Molay asking to be turned to face the cathedral, and his hands left free enough to hold in prayer, and he burned, by the general testimony, without a sound that gave his enemies anything. Almost immediately, the story attached itself that he had summoned Pope and King from the flames to answer before God within the year. And whether or not any bystander truly heard those words over a fire, the year cooperated with the legend to an almost indecent degree. Clement V was dead within a month. Philip IV, a healthy man in his mid-40s, was dead by the end of November, dropped by a stroke while hunting. Europe noticed. Europe talked about it for the next 500 years. A century later, the stake claimed the 2 most famous victims in its whole history, within 16 years of each other, and both deaths were watched and written up by people standing close enough to give us the small details. And the small details are where these deaths stop being history and start being a person. Jan Hus was a Czech priest and university rector in Prague, a preacher of enormous popular following who hammered at clerical corruption and above all at the sale of indulgences, drawing on the Englishman John Wycliffe, and by 1414 his case had become an international crisis, and the great church council meeting at Constance summoned him to answer for his teaching. He went voluntarily. He went because the Emperor Sigismund issued him a safe conduct, imperial protection there and back, and within weeks of his arrival in Constance he was arrested anyway, the council taking the position, when the awkwardness was raised, that promises made to a heretic did not bind, a principle every accused heretic in Europe would chew on for the next century. The man had the emperor's own seal in his baggage, and he went into a cell, and the cells were part of the punishment. Hus spent stretches of his imprisonment in the Dominican friary on the lake, in a cell adjoining the latrines, chained at night, and he sickened badly there. Fevers, vomiting, headaches that stopped him preparing any defense. And his letters from prison survive, asking friends for a Bible, for warm clothing, thanking supporters, worrying about the people back home. Months of that. Then hearings that were closer to shouting matches, where his attempts to explain were drowned out, and a final formula was put in front of him: abjure the errors. He answered consistently that he could not abjure opinions he had never held, that to swear off things he did not believe would itself be a lie before God, and that if anyone would show him his error from Scripture, he would recant with joy. The council was not there to debate Scripture with him. On the 6th of July, 1415, in the Cathedral of Constance, in the presence of the emperor whose safe conduct had brought him there, Hus was condemned. We know the rest almost minute by minute because a citizen of Constance, Ulrich Rickenthal, made a record of the council, and others wrote too. First, the degradation, and the degradation ritual is its own piece of engineered cruelty. They vested Hus in the full garments of a priest at the altar, as if for mass, chalice in his hands, and then stripped it all off him piece by piece, each vestment removed with a formula of cursing. The chalice was taken from his hands with the words that this cup of salvation was taken from him. His tonsure was destroyed, the consecrated patch of scalp cut apart, the priest unmade in front of the crowd before the man was. Then they put a paper crown on his head, nearly 2 feet tall by one account, painted with 3 devils tearing at a soul, lettered with the word Heresy, arch-heretic, and the bishops committed his soul to the devil, and Hus answered aloud that he committed it to the Lord Jesus Christ. Rickenthal counted more than 1,000 armed men in the escort that walked him out of the city, past a churchyard fire where his books were already burning, which Hus, we're told, smiled at. At the meadow outside the walls they tied him to the stake with wet ropes and a chain at the neck, and stacked the wood mixed with straw to his chin. And then, with everything in place, the empire made him one last offer, the marshal riding up to ask whether he would recant even now and live, and the offer at that exact moment, with the straw at his chin, lays the system's real priority bare. A recantation from that stake, in front of that crowd, was worth more to the council than the man's death. Hus refused it, saying in the reported words that the principal intention of his preaching had been to turn people from sin, and that he would gladly seal what he had written with his death. The fire was lit. Witnesses say he sang, "Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me," through 2 verses, and into the 3rd until the wind bent the flame into his face, and then his lips kept moving for the space of a few prayers more, and then he was gone. And what the executioners did afterward is, in its way, the most instructive part of the whole day. They broke the burned body down, smashed the bones, found the heart insufficiently consumed, and skewered it on a sharpened stave to roast it away entirely, burned his clothes and shoes on the same fire, and then shoveled every ounce of ash and fragment into the Rhine so that nothing, down to a thread or a knucklebone, could go home to Bohemia as a relic. The Church understood exactly how relics worked. It had built that economy, and it strip-mined this death to keep the ore out of enemy hands. It failed anyway. Bohemian pilgrims reportedly carried away scoops of soil from under the execution spot, and within 5 years Bohemia was in open religious revolt, armies with his name on their banners, and the council that burned one priest spent the next generation fighting his mourners. 16 years later, in Rouen, the fire took a teenager. Joan of Arc's story is so famous it can slip past us how young she was and how alone she was at the end. 19 years old, a farm girl who could not sign her name, captured in battle and sold to the English, and tried under church process. An inquisitorial heresy trial run by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, staffed by dozens of learned clergy, with the University of Paris weighing in. The full intellectual apparatus of the church deployed against an illiterate girl in chains, over her claim that her voices came from God and, with absurd centrality, over her wearing of men's clothing. The trial transcript survives, and her answers keep landing clean off the page. Asked if she was in a state of grace, a perfect trap. Yes is presumption, no is confession, she answered. If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there. And you can almost hear the assessor's pens pause. They broke her once. In May 1431, taken out to a scaffold beside a waiting executioner and cart, sentence moments from being pronounced, she signed an abjuration, some mark on a paper whose contents are themselves disputed, and was returned to prison, to an English military prison, guarded by soldiers, rather than the church prison with women attendants that the rules provided, and within days she had resumed men's clothes. The accounts of why differ, that her woman's dress was taken from her, that she put the male clothing back on to protect herself from her guards, and past those accounts sits the trial's cold mechanics. Resuming the clothes made her a relapsed heretic, and relapse, as the Templars found, has one sentence. Cauchon, meeting colleagues after the news, is reported to have told the English, in effect, "Be of good cheer, it is done." On the 30th of May, 1431, in the old market square of Rouen, she was burned on a plaster scaffold built deliberately high so the whole crowd could see, and so, some noted, the executioner could not reach in to shorten her suffering by strangulation, the small mercy sometimes granted. She asked for a cross. An English soldier in the crowd tied 2 sticks together and handed the little cross up to her, and she kissed it and put it inside her dress against her chest, and a friar held a processional cross up before her eyes as the fire climbed, at her own request, holding it high so she could see it through the smoke, and she called the name of Jesus until she couldn't. The executioner, a man named Geoffroy Therage, sought out friars afterward in genuine distress and told them he feared he was damned, for he had burned a holy woman, and he added a detail that spread everywhere, that her heart had resisted the fire, that despite the oil and sulphur and charcoal he applied, it would not burn. The English had the remains burned twice more to powder and thrown into the Seine, the same anti-relic logic as at Constance, the same river solution. 25 years later, a papal court reopened the case, heard the surviving witnesses, and annulled the entire verdict as tainted by fraud and error. 1456, formal parchment vindication for a woman 25 years dead, and in 1920 the same church canonized her, and both entries sit in the same institution's ledger, the trial and the sainthood, 5 centuries apart. England came late to burning its own, and when it started, It started with a law whose name says everything with no decoration at all. De heretico comburendo, on the burning of a heretic. Parliament passed it in 1401, pushed hard by Archbishop Thomas Arundel to deal with the Lollards, the homegrown followers of John Wycliffe, who wanted scripture in English and had sharp opinions about the wealth of the clergy, and the statutes set out the procedure with administrative calm. Relapsed or obstinate heretics were to be handed by the church to the secular arm and burned before the people in a high place, the wording itself specifying visibility, so that, the act says, such punishment might strike fear into the minds of others. Fear as stated legislative intent. They wrote the purpose into the preamble. The first man through the new machinery was already in custody while the ink dried. William Sawtry was a parish priest from Lynn in Norfolk, who had been caught holding Lollard opinions once before, in 1399, and had abjured them publicly, and then moved to London and gone right back to preaching them, above all the opinion that the consecrated bread remained bread, and that was relapse, and by now we know what relapse meant. Convicted before Arundel, Sawtry was put through the same degradation ritual Hughes would later suffer, stripped of office step by step. The vessels taken from his hands, down through every minor order, until they finished by scraping his scalp and putting a layman's cap on him. And then the layman was passed to the sheriff, and in the first days of March 1401, at Smithfield, the London livestock and execution ground, William Sawtry was chained upright in a barrel hoop arrangement at a stake and burned alive, the first person put to death for heresy under English statute law. Smithfield would keep that specialty for 150 years, and the smell of it, people who lived near the later burnings wrote, carried into the surrounding streets and lingered. 9 years on, the same square, a case with an even harder edge, because this one had a prince in the audience and an offer on the table. John Badby was a tailor, or by some records a blacksmith from the Evesham area, a layman with no Latin, who had decided from listening and thinking that the host could not be the actual body of Christ, and who said so with a workingman's bluntness that survives in the record, that if every consecrated host were truly God's body, then there were 20,000 gods in England, and he believed in one. The church gave Badby chance after chance to take it back, examinations at Worcester, then before Arundel and a bench of bishops, and he would not budge, and on the 1st of March 1410 he was taken to Smithfield and put into an empty barrel at the stake, and the fire was lit. And standing close by was the 23-year-old Prince of Wales, the future Henry V. The chronicler and martyrologist John Fox preserves what happened next. As the flame reached him, Badby cried out, "Mercy!" And the prince immediately ordered the fire pulled apart, and the barrel dragged off, and there, half burned, the tailor was offered everything, his life and a pension from the royal purse for the rest of his days, 3d a day. All of it for one recantation, spoken right there. A man already burning, given a guaranteed income to stop believing a sentence, Badby refused. They put him back, and this time it went to the end. Whatever you make of his theology, the offer itself is the whole apparatus in miniature. The church did not especially need Badby dead. It needed him to submit, out loud, in public, and his death was simply the price it was willing to have him pay for declining. England burned perhaps a dozen heretics between 1401 and the 1480s, tiny numbers next to the continental tribunals, and it didn't matter. Numerically, it never mattered anywhere. One barrel at Smithfield every few years kept the lesson current for 2 million people. Terror is remarkably efficient. Away from the scaffolds, the ordinary weekly diet of fear came in story form, and the men who cooked that diet left us their recipe books. Preachers worked from collections of exemplar, short, punchy, cautionary tales to drop into sermons, and the greatest of these collections came from a monk we've already met at Béziers, Caesarius of Heisterbach, whose Dialogus Miraculorum, written between 1219 and 1223, gathers 746 miracle stories into a friendly question and answer between an old monk and a novice. 65 manuscripts of it survive, meaning it sat on lecterns all over Europe, and its final section, on the dead, is essentially a catalogue of afterlife horror sized for pulpit delivery. A dead usurer's corpse that consecrated ground keeps rejecting. A knight who mocked the sacraments carried off bodily by demons in front of witnesses, the household hearing him scream over the rooftops. Sinners returning to their relatives by night, on fire, or bent under punishment shaped to their exact secret sin. Begging for masses, always begging for masses. The moral of nearly every ghost in the collection being that the dead need masses and the living had better arrange them. A village heard 2 or 3 of these a month, every month for life, and Caesarius was merely the best-stocked collection in a crowded field. The saints themselves came with teeth in this culture. Modern piety pictures a saint as gentle by definition, and plenty of medieval stories run the other way. Saints as touchy, territorial patrons who avenged insults to their shrines and their tenants with disease, madness and death, and the miracle books of great shrines record the punishments as proudly as the healings. The knight who robbed the abbey's lands and rotted, the scoffer at the relics struck blind at the feast. Monks made active use of this with a liturgy that startles people when they first hear of it. The clamour and its extreme form, the humiliation of the saints. A monastery being bullied by some local lord and lacking any soldiers of its own would go to work on the supernatural plane. The monks prostrate on the floor chanting the clamour to God against their oppressor, and in the strong version they punished their own saint to force the issue, taking the relics out of their golden shrine and setting them down on the bare floor, on ash, sometimes laying thorns over them and stopping the bells. The saint formally humiliated, degraded from honour, until he bestirred himself to defend his people, at which point, ideally, the offending lord sickened, or his horse threw him, or his conscience or his neighbours got to him, and the relics went back up amid rejoicing. Down in the nave, meanwhile, the laity heard formal liturgical curses on malefactors. May they be cursed in the house and the field, in eating and drinking, waking and sleeping, the whole of a life itemized and each item damned, and whether or not the crops of the accursed actually failed, every listener walked out knowing the church could aim God like an instrument. Even the buildings preached fear. Walk into almost any English parish church before the Reformation and look up at the arch between you and the altar, and filling it in cheap bold pigment, the doom, the last judgment, Christ enthroned on the rainbow, the dead climbing naked out of their graves. the saved filing politely up one side, and, always painted with more energy and more budget, the damned on the other, roped together in chains, prodded by devils with flesh hooks, tipped head first into a hell mouth, the gaping fanged jaws of a monstrous head, with the painters taking evident care to include crowned heads and mitred bishops in the roped line of the damned. Many dooms added the scales, Saint Michael weighing each soul against its record, a demon hanging its full weight off the sin pan to drag the balance down, cheating openly right there in paint. And the lesson underneath was that the other side plays foul, and the only counterweight that held was the churches, the masses, and the alms dropped into your pan while you still breathed. Every Sunday and every funeral of your life, that image sat above the priest's head while he spoke, and on feast days the image got up and moved, because the great cycles of mystery plays staged Judgment Day in the street, with a built hellmouth as the star prop. A huge monster head with jaws that worked, packed with pyrotechnics, real fire, real smoke rolling out of the throat, costumed devils shrieking into the crowd and dragging the damned souls, played by your own neighbors, screaming into the jaws, and the account books of the guilds that mounted these plays survive, with their little line items, so much for keeping the fire in Hellmouth, so much for mending the devil's garments, singed presumably in the line of duty. Towns paid for their own annual preview of damnation and turned out in crowds to watch it eat people. After the plague, a new picture joined the doom on Europe's walls, and it cut out the judgment entirely and went straight for the nerve. The Dance of Death. The earliest famous version went up in 1424 on the cloister wall of the Holy Innocents Cemetery in Paris, the busiest burial ground in the city, a working charnel place where older bones were dug up and stacked in open galleries to make room for new dead, so people strolled and courted beside walls of skulls, and on the wall beside them ran the painting, a long chain of figures in strict order of rank, Pope, Emperor, Cardinal, King, on down through the merchant and the labourer to the infant, and between every two of them a grinning corpse, half rotted, taking each by the hand and pulling them into the dance. Verses ran underneath, the dead addressing each living figure by station. Come, bishop, your mitre will not excuse you. Come, ploughman, you have rested little, now rest forever. And the infant gets a couplet too, in some versions protesting that it cannot even speak yet, and the corpse takes its hand anyway. Copies and variations spread across Europe within a generation. Basel, Lübeck, London, printed versions with woodcuts for people who would never see the murals, and the message needed no priest to unpack. Whoever you are, whatever you have, the hand is already reaching for yours. The plague had made that claim believable at street level. Everyone by then had watched death take households in rank order and no order at all, and the church folded the image straight into its preaching on readiness, on dying prepared, on the state of your soul this very evening, since the dance, as everyone now understood, sends no notice ahead. All of it converged on a single room at the end, the room where you died, and the whole system stood around that bed. Around 1415, most likely out of the same Council of Constance that burned Jan Hus, an anonymous Dominican produced a Latin treatise on dying well, the Ars Moriendi, and about 1450 a short illustrated version appeared as a block book, 11 woodcuts a barely literate person could follow, and between them the two versions became one of the most copied works in Europe, hundreds of manuscripts, edition after printed edition in every major language. The demand had been created by the century itself. The plague had taught everyone that death comes fast and the priest often doesn't, so here was a mass-produced manual for the worst hour, do-it-yourself dying. And the picture it paints of that hour is a battlefield. The dying man, Morians, lies in bed, and the room is crowded, and the crowd includes demons, physically present around the mattress, under it, leaning over the headboard, hideous and horned, pressing in for the last hour because the last hour decides everything, and against them angels, saints, Mary, Christ, contesting the same few feet of air. 5 temptations come in sequence: doubt of the faith, despair over sins, impatience in the suffering, vainglory, and greed, the clinging to property and even to the people you love. The manual counting your own family at the bedside as a temptation if love of them pulls your mind from God. The despair woodcut is the one to find if you only ever look at one piece of medieval art. The dying man shrinking into his pillow while 6 demons crowd the bed thrusting scrolls at him, each scroll itemizing a sin. Behold thy sins, thou hast perjured thyself, thou hast slain, and the artists put the man's actual victims in the room, the figure he wronged, the person he killed, conjured around the bed as exhibits. The whole scene functioning as hell's cross-examination with the defendant already dying. Each temptation has its answering print, the angel's counter-argument, and in the final woodcut Morians gets it right. Dies with the candle in his hands and his mind on God, a priest at his side, and a small human soul slips out of his mouth into an angel's arms while the demons below writhe, and one of them, in a touch I've always liked, is scripted to howl that he is confounded. Even hell files a complaint in this literature. Behind the woodcuts stood the practice, and the practice had leverage in it to the very last breath. The viaticum, the final communion, and extreme unction came through a priest, or they did not come, and the historical record contains its scatter of cases of the sacraments delayed or withheld over unpaid tithes, or an unresolved dispute. The dying person given to understand that the church's hand could stay closed. Mortuary fees collected the best animal or the best garment of the household at the moment of death itself. And where the system worked as designed, and for most people most of the time it did, the priest arrived through the dark with the host carried under a cloth, a boy walking ahead ringing a handbell, and everyone the little procession passed knelt in the street, because God was going by on his way to a deathbed, and in the sick room the familiar words came down over the fear like a hand on the shoulder. And whatever else is true of everything I've told you tonight, that comfort was real to the person in the bed. Terror and consolation, the same institution, the same 10 minutes. The church had made itself the only door out of a burning building it had spent 1,000 years describing, and almost every single person in Europe, at the end, reached for the door. One more sound belongs in that room before we close, the passing bell. When a parishioner lay at the point of death, The church tower rang a slow, distinctive toll, so the whole community would know a soul was leaving and would stop, wherever they stood, and pray for it in its last struggle, the moment of death being understood as the single most dangerous instant of the entire journey, the instant the demons contested hardest. People heard that bell all their lives, counted the strokes that told them a man or a woman was going, and knew that one day the parish would stand still for the sound of their own. And underneath everything ran the fear with no remedy at all, sudden death, mors improviser, the fall from the ladder, the sword in the dark, death with no priest and no candle, the ledger closed mid-sentence, and the litanies of the age asked for deliverance from it by name, from sudden and unprovided death. Good Lord, deliver us. Whole devotions grew up around dodging it, the enormous St. Christopher painted opposite the door of 1,000 churches on the promise, widely repeated, that whoever looked on his image would not die unprepared that day. One glance on the way to the fields as insurance, and travellers and the sick wore his medal for the same reason. A civilization that prays daily, by name, against dying without a particular institution's staff member in the room, is a civilization whose deepest fear has an address. The Knight Tundale reached for it too, back where we started. He lived out his days in penance, telling his hell to anyone who'd hear it, and the monk who wrote it down shaped how dying felt for 300 years of Europeans he never met. Marcus finished his manuscript in Regensburg in 1149 and closed it with a conventional monk's request. One line, asking whoever held the book to pray for him. Even the man who built the nightmare wanted somebody to put in a word for his soul. That's where I'll leave it tonight. This one took a lot of digging, and some of it, honestly, I'm still carrying around, so if a particular story stuck with you, tell me which one in the comments. I go through every single one, usually with coffee, occasionally with something stronger after an episode like this. Thanks for spending a few quiet hours here. Enormous thanks to the Patreon crew and the YouTube members who keep this whole operation running. Links for both are in the description and the pinned comment if you want in. Sleep well if you can. See you in the next one.